We view this completely unprovoked attack by the United States and Israel on Iran as an unprovoked act of international armed aggression.
Some time ago, President Putin addressed the German people. What message would you like to share with the people in Germany?
Gegen den Strom. Zur Person.
Welcome to Against the Current. I'm here to show you positions and perspectives that the propaganda media keep hidden. The attack by the United States and Israel on Iran on February 28, 2026, has shaken the global balance of power. Militarily, the United States was caught off guard by Iran's massive resistance and counterstrikes. The U.S. now faces the threat of defeat. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz has pushed the world economy to the brink of collapse.
Die Weltökonomie an den Rand des Absturzes gebracht. Und seit längerem wird in Washington ein Kulturkampf.
For quite some time now, Washington has been invoking a kind of culture war between what it calls the Western world of values and the rest of the world. That's what I'll be discussing today with an experienced Russian diplomat. He studied German language and literature at Lomonosov University in Moscow. He's been in the diplomatic service for many years, worked at the Russian Foreign Ministry in Moscow, and since 2018, he's been serving in Berlin as the ambassador of the Russian Federation. Hello, Sergey Nechayev. Good day to you. Mr. Nechayev, Mr. Ambassador, does the war being waged by Israel and the United States against Iran play into Russia's hands?
Gegen den Iran, Russland in die Hände.
Auf keinen Fall. Wir betrachten diesen Überfall.
Absolutely not. We see this attack, an entirely unprovoked assault by the United States and Israel against Iran, as an unprovoked act of international armed aggression. That is the President's clear position, the position of the Foreign Ministry, and our official stance as a whole. Iran has not provoked anyone. All the claims that Iran possesses or intends to use nuclear weapons have proven unfounded. Iran has been inspected more than any other country by the International Atomic Energy Agency, and not a single sign of a nuclear weapon has been confirmed by those inspections or tests. As for Iran's peaceful use of nuclear energy, that is completely legitimate.
Das ist absolut legitim. Und Iran darf Atomenergie in friedlichen...
And Iran has the right to use nuclear energy for peaceful purposes. We have a nuclear power plant there, as everyone knows, Bushehr, and that's completely normal. So there was absolutely no reason to start this attack, this act of aggression. The idea of changing the regime is, at the very least, counterproductive, and there's simply no way to justify it. Ayatollah Khamenei, who was killed during this aggression, is and was a completely legitimate spiritual leader of the people for more than 40 or 50 years. The people of Iran respected him and had no objections to him. Entirely legitimate. That's why he's being mourned so deeply, and that's why Iran declared what they call a holy war.
Proklamiert. Das ist natürlich ein großer Fehler aus meiner Sicht.
From my point of view, that was clearly a major mistake by our American colleagues and the Israelis. The consequences are being felt everywhere. And it's by no means just about the Strait of Hormuz and the impact on oil and gas. It's about the destabilization of the entire region, which we can now see very clearly. Iran has the right to self-defense and is carrying out corresponding strikes against its neighbors. They've suffered losses there, which we deeply regret, because normally the Gulf states are our good partners, and we have very good relations with all of them.
Und wir haben mit allen sehr gute Beziehungen. Es geht bei weitem nicht Öl und Gas.
It's by no means just about oil and gas. Some countries simply have strategic partnerships with them. Some have provided good mediation or services, real help in the context of our relations, especially regarding the conflict in Ukraine. In fact, we have good partnerships with all of them. I'm sorry that these people now have to count the dead and the wounded, let alone deal with the energy situation. Our nuclear power plant in Bushehr, which I've already mentioned, is of course a concern, because it could lead to a nuclear disaster. Innocent people are being killed. And that strike on the girls' school in Iran, where 170 children died, that's truly a catastrophe.
Der Sicherheitsrat der
The United Nations Security Council has condemned Iran's counterattacks. The Russian Federation didn't vote against the resolution, it simply abstained. Why?
sich lediglich enthalten. Warum?
Wir haben einige Punkte dort.
We had a few points there. Well, we can live with that. In any case, there were calls for all parties to stop everything, and we support that. Because we believe the entire aggression has to end. The conflict needs to be steered into political and diplomatic channels to bring the war to an end. That's something we can live with. That's why we didn't veto it. But we did put forward our own draft resolution, where we clearly named the actions of the United States and Israel in relation to the aggression. Some of our partners in the Security Council didn't want that. We coordinated with other colleagues, but the others didn't want it included. So, we decided to support this draft resolution from Bahrain to make sure those good phrases wouldn't be forgotten.
Nicht vergessen gehen.
Was hat Ihrer Meinung nach
In your view, what drove the President of the United States into this war, into this attack? Was it Netanyahu? Was it the neoconservatives in the United States? Or was it a geopolitical calculation? What do you think?
War es eine geopolitische Überlegung? Was meinen Sie?
Da ist mir ehrlich gesagt sehr schwer.
To be honest, it's really hard for me to get inside the head of the US president. I honestly don't know. But I can see that the situation right now is hardly developing in his favor, and I'm far from convinced that this move was the right one.
Dieser Schritt richtig war.
Ich habe neulich eine Diskussion.
I recently gave a talk and hosted a discussion about the war in the Middle East. During that event, a man spoke up and said, "Well, that's exactly the same thing the Americans and Israelis are doing now, what the Russians did in Ukraine." What would you say to that man?
Welche Antwort würden Sie diesem Mann geben?
Ich würde Folgendes sagen, dass die
I'd put it this way. The roots of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, which is being widely discussed today, are completely different, and they go back a long way. We might talk more about that later, because after the collapse of the Soviet Union, some of our Western colleagues saw Ukraine as a kind of stronghold, as an anti-Russia. And during the 1990s and the 2000s, I'd say Ukraine was being prepared to play that role, drawn into NATO, and with neo-Nazi tendencies in society being encouraged. Those were, I'd say, the clear reasons why we couldn't tolerate that situation. We recognized Ukraine as an independent state in 1991. After, if I'm not mistaken, in July of 1990, Ukraine adopted a Declaration of Independence that proclaimed the country to be nuclear-free, non-aligned, and neutral.
und neutral proklamiert wurde. Außerdem waren die
In addition, the rights of the Russian-speaking population and the Russian language were guaranteed. That was absolutely fine. In 1991, we recognized Ukraine with that status. But then things really started to change. And for some of our Western colleagues, the idea of closer ties between Russia and Ukraine after the collapse of the Soviet Union was hardly acceptable. So they had to turn Ukraine into an opponent. How? First, by pushing for NATO membership. Not just membership itself, but also the military and technical development of Ukrainian territory. Second, by encouraging neo-Nazi tendencies, meaning the rejection of the Russian language and the rejection of the Russian Orthodox Church.
Akzeptanz der russischen orthodoxen Kirche. Und das war schon besorgniserregend, auch.
And it was really worrying to see that even former Nazi collaborators from the Second World War were on the banners of the new Ukrainian revolution. Bandera and Shukevich are, for the former Soviet Union, absolutely clear Nazi criminals, but their names were on the flags of what was called the Revolution of Dignity. That was not acceptable to us, because neo-Nazi ideas, anti-Russian ideas, racist ideas, those are for us something we simply cannot accept on a fundamental level. We lost so much in the Second World War. 27 million people because of the Nazi regime. So it's absolutely something we cannot tolerate. And maybe some of our Western colleagues use that so that we wouldn't come to terms with it. In fact, we didn't want this war.
Eigentlich wollten wir diesen Krieg nicht. Und wir machen heute alles, damit dieser Krieg aufhört.
And today, we're doing everything we can to stop this war. But it didn't start with us, and it wasn't caused by us. After the well-known Maidan events, which we consider a clearly unconstitutional coup, things could have been eased or settled if our Western colleagues, who acted as sponsors or mediators of that revolution, or between President Yanukovych and the opposition sitting at the table back then, had followed through. But the new Maidan government began using armed force against the Russian-speaking regions of Ukraine that refused to accept that coup.
Die diesen Staatsstreich nicht akzeptiert haben. Und das war natürlich in erster Linie die Krim.
And of course, that was mainly about Crimea and the southeast, meaning Donetsk, Luhansk, and the others. That's where the so-called anti-terror operation began, and we tried to find a solution. In 2015, as you and your viewers surely know, the relevant agreements were signed in Minsk, at the highest level, by the President of the Russian Federation, the President of Ukraine, the German Chancellor, and the President of the French Republic. A plan was developed there stating that the regions in southeastern Ukraine were to remain part of Ukraine. But for that to happen, Kiev had to meet certain conditions.
Aber dafür musste Kiew einige Voraussetzungen schaffen. Nicht mal eine Position dieses Planes wurde.
Not a single part of that plan was ever carried out. And more than that, we later learned that this was never even the goal of our Western partners. What they really needed was time for Ukraine to build up its weapons and military potential. Then things went further, because the military and technical development of Ukraine kept advancing, and that was already becoming somewhat dangerous for our own security. That's why, in December 2021, we put forward a proposal to the United States, to President Biden's administration at the time, to our colleagues in NATO, and I believe also to the OSCE, where we laid out our ideas for how to resolve the situation.
Regelung der Situation untergebracht haben. Einen dazu, das ist die Frage der.
That brings us to the question of NATO membership, but we were simply told, that's none of your business, that's up to Ukraine, and that's the end of it. Then things really escalated in February 2022. But by the end of March, we were able to mediate for the third time when we received a proposal from the Ukrainian side for a peace settlement. And we said, okay, on that basis, we can talk. Back then, we even pulled back our troops. But then that well-known British politician came along and told the Ukrainian colleagues not to sign that document. And after that, the fighting continued. That's how the story of this conflict went.
So war die Geschichte dieses Konflikts.
Das heißt, der Westen hat.
So, does that mean the West provoked this war from the perspective of the Russian Federation and then deliberately prolonged it by letting the Istanbul talks fail in the spring of 2022? Can we put it that way?
Verlängert, kann man das sagen?
Das kann man ruhig sagen, denn die
You can definitely say that, because the weakening of the Russian Federation was probably the main goal of this whole conflict for certain circles in Western politics. The weakening of Russia, maybe even further, the continued breakup of the Russian Federation, and the corresponding exploitation of, I'd say, Russian information. That might sound like an exaggeration, but I can't completely rule it out either. That's why the trigger for this entire situation was, of course, Ukraine's upcoming NATO membership, and with all the consequences that come with it, because the launch sites, the installation of various missiles with a flight time of 8 to 10 minutes to Moscow and St. Petersburg, that's really pushing things too far.
Das ist schon zu hoch.
Ich habe im Donbass bei meinen Reisen ins Kriegs.
During my trips to the war zone in Donbass, I met people who said very clearly, President Putin left us hanging. He should have invaded back in 2014. So why didn't the Russian Federation take military action at that time?
Nicht militärisch reagiert.
Wir haben immer versucht, die Kriegshandlungen zu
We
vermeiden.
always tried to avoid military action. That's why we talked with our Ukrainian colleagues and said, this can't go on like this. Then in 2015, we had the Minsk agreements. The regions of Donetsk and Luhansk didn't want to stay in Ukraine. After all the deaths in those regions from shelling by Ukrainian forces and the so-called anti-terror operation, they didn't want that anymore. But President Putin and the Russian side said, stay within Ukraine, but we'll negotiate with the Ukrainian leadership, with the support of Western mediators, our colleagues from Germany and France, who acted as co-sponsors, so that the Ukrainian leadership would create a special status for Donetsk and Luhansk. The idea was to stop the shelling and make sure their rights and freedoms were preserved. That's what we achieved in Minsk back then. But unfortunately, our Western partners did nothing to make sure Ukraine fulfilled those obligations.
The war in Ukraine has now entered its fifth year. What are the war aims of the Russian government?
President
Putin has made that clear several times. For us, NATO membership is absolutely out of the question. Neutral, not part of any alliance. No nuclear status. There are various rumors. People are saying that Ukraine might once again be interested in what's called a dirty bomb, and that discussion surfaces in public from time to time. We've heard different statements, different versions, coming from Britain, from France, about nuclear weapons, and of course, that's worrying and harmful. That's the issue of NATO and weapons. Secondly, it's about basic rights and freedoms for Russian-speaking people in Ukraine, because the Russian language is legally banned and the Russian Orthodox Church is legally banned.
Die russische orthodoxe Kirche ist gesetzlich verboten. Die russische Kultur ist
Russian culture is, as people like to say, cancelled, or, to put it plainly, it just doesn't work anymore. Our shared history doesn't work anymore either. Monuments to Russian writers and cultural figures are being torn down. Even our common history in World War II is no longer accepted. We see that as a neo-Nazi phenomenon. And these things aren't being toned down or stopped. They're actually being encouraged. That's a very dangerous development. We also absolutely don't want a massive army to be stationed there, let alone foreign troops. That's not acceptable to us either. Well, that's part of it.
Naja, das einiges davon.
In jüngerer Zeit hat Präsident Putin
Recently, President Putin and also Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov have used the term New Russia more often. If I remember correctly, that refers to the old territories from the time of Catherine II, and those territories include the city of Odessa, which was once Russian. Should we expect an attack, a pincer movement by the Russian army on Odessa?
Um Gottes Willen, ich bin auf keinen Fall Orakel von Delphi.
Good heavens, I'm certainly not the Oracle of Delphi, Mr. Barth. I really don't want to get into that discussion. But you're absolutely right. What's called New Russia refers to the regions that were developed back in the time of Catherine II and Prince Potemkin. And basically, everything that still exists there today was organized by Russia. The industry, the coal mines, and all sorts of other things. That area was an industrial region, an industrial center of Ukraine. I believe about half of Ukraine's entire economic output was conducted with Russia.
Nur mit Russland abgewickelt. Und die Leute sprechen dort Russisch, die Kultur.
And the people there speak Russian. The culture is, and always has been, Russian. The church is Russian too, not to mention the millions of family ties between people who live there and those living in Russia, across all the border regions. Well, I'd put it this way, maybe a bit boldly. That's his people. That's one people. You can't tell from the names whether someone's Ukrainian or Russian. They're completely the same, just like in our own country.
Since the talks between President Trump and President Putin last August in Anchorage, Alaska, negotiations between the United States and the Russian Federation have been taking place under strict confidentiality. By now, it seems those talks aren't moving forward quickly. In fact, they appear to be falling behind, with the war in Iran taking precedence and the American side seemingly losing interest. Can you tell me whether there's still any hope at all for a negotiated solution to the war in Ukraine?
Wir sind für eine Verhandlungslösung.
We're in favor of a negotiated solution. We appreciate the efforts of the new U.S. administration of President Trump to resolve the conflict through political and diplomatic means. The previous U.S. administration, as we've said, had nothing to do with a peaceful solution. And from our point of view, President Trump is sincere in his efforts to settle the conflict in Ukraine. The talks were serious and constructive, including the atmosphere in Alaska. At that time, we accepted the American side's proposals as a compromise, and on that basis, we were able to continue the negotiations. Some real results were achieved, and it was about, let's say, the humanitarian side of things, exchanging bodies, exchanging prisoners of war, several rounds of that, which was positive. As for the so-called 28 points, the plan, I haven't read it myself, unfortunately, but these positive signals from the U.S. administration were by no means welcomed by everyone around the world, including our European colleagues. And that's really, really unfortunate. The next round was actually supposed to take place, but that was before the Middle East conflict that broke out in one of the Gulf states.
Golfanrainerstaat, da wurde das auch gedacht, nicht nur in Genf oder in der.
That was being considered too, not just in Geneva or Istanbul, but there as well. Right now, there's a pause. It's basically a forced one, but it's far from over. A new round has to take place. I can't say when or where, that's not really a question for me, but the negotiation process is definitely not finished. I understand that our American colleagues are mostly focused on the Strait of Hormuz at the moment, which is a pity, because that's also a serious issue. I'd say one consequence of the Middle East conflict is that the negotiations involving Ukraine aren't moving forward either.
When
I think back to the Munich Security Conference in February, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio talked about a culture war between Western civilization and the rest of the world. You really can't call that an effort at rapprochement. How do you assess the Munich Security Conference?
Wie bewerten Sie die Münchner Sicherheitskonferenz?
Na, schauen Sie mal, also wir hatten früher.
Well, look, we used to have very good relations with NATO. Back in the 1990s, we even set up a joint council. But then, NATO went its own way. Leaving aside all the promises made to us during German reunification, that NATO wouldn't move even a single inch eastward, there were 5 or 6 waves of expansion to the east. And it wasn't just about expansion. It was about the military and technical development of the territories that are now part of NATO, the Baltic states, Poland, Eastern Europe. That's not a small thing. So, from today's point of view, I'd say closer relations between Russia and NATO aren't easy. The right conditions have to be created for that, but the ball is in NATO's court.
Dafür ist der Ball auf der NATO-Seite. Was die europäische Sicherheitsarchitektur anbelangt.
When it comes to the European security architecture, unfortunately, what we're hearing today from several Western European capitals is this. There can only be a security architecture in Europe, but not with Russia. Either without Russia or even against Russia. And of course, that raises a lot of questions. From the very beginning, we've been building a common European home, or at least trying to. Together with the European Union, we developed a great roadmap with what I'd call 4 shared freedoms of movement. We also had excellent relations with several Western European capitals, including Berlin. Truly unique. And yet today, we're hearing from some of those same capitals that Russia must suffer a strategic defeat, that Russia is an adversary, that Russia is an enemy.
Und 2029 wird Russland einen Krieg gegen die NATO.
And in 2029, Russia will supposedly start a war against NATO or against Europe. That idea is already treated almost like doctrine in some Western European capitals. Where it comes from, I can't really say. Maybe you should ask your viewers. Maybe they've heard something. But we've actually made a proposal. First of all, we have no intention of attacking anyone in Western Europe or in NATO. In fact, not long ago, the president even suggested preparing a joint document with mutual guarantees. No attacks, mutual security assurances, all of it written down and firmly agreed upon. So all these rumors that Russia is going to attack NATO, as the president says, that's nonsense. But unfortunately, when it comes to any real rapprochement today,
Aber von einer Annäherung können wir leider heute kaum sprechen.
Ist denn eine Annäherung
Is any kind of rapprochement in the conflict over Ukraine even possible if Washington is turning the war into a European one, and the Europeans are eager to join in and keep fighting it on their own?
und diesen Krieg alleine weiterführen wollen?
Da muss ich auch Sie vielleicht und Ihre Zuschauer.
I should probably remind you and your viewers that one of President Trump's very first points was this: letting Ukraine join NATO would be a mistake. He said it was a mistake by the previous U.S. administration to push for closer ties between Ukraine and NATO. And Mr. Trump, I'd say, brushed that off right away.
Trump hat das sofort, würde ich sagen, vom Tisch gefegt. Ich weiß nicht, wie sich die Situation.
I don't know how the situation will develop, or whether the Europeans are ready to enter into these negotiations. But our European colleagues can be quite strict with us at times. And I'd say that some European capitals are taking an absolutely one-sided position in this conflict. There are probably only a few today who could really act as true mediators or negotiation partners. In the past, for example, Germany played a leading mediating role within the European Union, and that earned it great respect across the EU.
Große Ansehen auch in der EU gebracht hat. Jetzt kann ich kaum sprechen, wer von unseren europäischen.
Right now, it's hard for me to say which of our European partners could actually lead these talks, because all of them are focused on Ukraine's victory, or, to put it another way, on Russia's defeat, its strategic defeat. There's a lot being done to impose every possible kind of sanction against Russia, to support the Kiev government financially, economically, and militarily, and to do everything possible to further weaken or contain Russia. That puts the negotiating partners in a difficult position. Normally, you'd expect a bit more objectivity.
Muss man mehr Objektivität an den Tag legen.
Der deutsche Außenminister Johann Wadefuhl
The German foreign minister, Johann Wadefuhl, said that Russia will always be our enemy. We've heard similar statements from Ms. Kallas, the EU's High Representative for Foreign Affairs, and also from Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. And when I talk with my good friend Michael von der Schulenburg, a member of the European Parliament, he tells me, "You can't even imagine what's going on here. They want the war." So the question is, can you negotiate with people like that, or do you just have to wait until their time is over?
Oder muss man warten, bis ihre Zeit vorbei ist?
Das ist natürlich sehr schwer, mit den Leuten zu verhandeln.
Of course, it's very difficult to negotiate with people who call their potential counterpart, if they mean Russia, an eternal enemy. What's more, lately I've been hearing some statements that remind me of the Russophobes in 19th century France, especially when it comes to the word barbarism. It's not the first time I've heard that recently. I've heard it before. Back in the 1930s, that word was used quite often. Hearing it again today really surprises me. Well, the colleagues you mentioned still show no sign of wanting a dialogue. We don't even see the slightest indication of a desire to propose a peace plan, and there are no signals of any willingness to negotiate. We're not hearing those signals from Berlin either, at least not so far.
Diese Signale bis jetzt nicht. Seit Mai ist die neue Bundesregierung an der.
Since May, the new federal government has been in charge in Berlin, and so far, we haven't heard a single proposal, not a single sign of willingness to talk, not even any indication of one. Well, from our side, we're ready to engage in a constructive dialogue with everyone, on equal footing, as equals, without lectures, without ultimatums, without finger-pointing. That's not something we find particularly pleasant. But on equal terms, constructively, as equals, so that our position is also respected. and that's important to us. That's a basic condition. We've always said, and it's written in the OSCE documents signed by all the political leaders of Europe, that the European security architecture cannot be built at the expense of the security of a third state.
Aufgebaut wird. Das bedeutet, dass die Interessen.
That means the interests, or rather the perspectives, of the Russian Federation also need to be taken into account in this new framework. National interests have to be considered as well. You just mentioned the Secretary of State, Mr. Rubio, and he's often quoted as saying that the United States and Russia each have their own national interests. Those interests are hardly ever identical, certainly not completely. But if there are areas where they do align, then we should use those shared points for mutual benefit. And when there are differences, we must absolutely avoid letting those differences in national interests turn into open conflict. That's an important point.
In your view, what would be the key elements of a pan-European security architecture?
Da wird ganz bestimmt.
It was made very clear, and President Putin has mentioned this several times, we want a lasting peace agreement with Ukraine, not a short-term one. We've already been deceived more than once by temporary ceasefires that were used to regroup and rearm. What we want is a permanent peace settlement. Maybe, apart from the UN Security Council, there could be a framework where security guarantees for all parties are clearly defined. And that's important. As for what could be written into such an agreement regarding NATO, things like being non-aligned, neutral, no nuclear threat, all of that could be put into a document that could also serve as part of the broader European security architecture.
Aber dazu gibt es genug kluge Köpfe.
But there are plenty of smart people working on that. You just mentioned the United Nations Security Council, which could approve a European security framework. Now, President Putin hasn't ruled out taking part in President Trump's peace fund. In fact, he said the capital could come from the frozen Russian assets. But isn't that very peace fund actually an attack on the United Nations? Or am I wrong about that?
Es gibt gewisse Parallelen natürlich, aber
there are, of course, certain parallels. We haven't completely ruled out taking part in this peace council or peace board, but we've paused for now to think it through. You're right, there are similarities between Mr. Trump's proposed peace council and the United Nations Security Council, and that's something we absolutely don't want to lose sight of. The UN Security Council is important, critically important, and that's where we want to stay engaged. When it comes to a separate initiative, a peace council from Mr. Trump specifically for the Gaza Strip, that's a different matter. We've suggested using funds from our frozen assets to help rebuild Gaza. So far, we haven't received any response from the U.S. administration. But the UN Security Council remains essential. I'd say it's our absolute priority. We were there at the founding of the United Nations, and from my point of view, that's where we intend to remain.
The frozen Russian assets and the attempt to, seize the Russian funds held by Euroclear in Brussels are still very much what many European politicians are after. How do you plan to deal with this issue?
We see all these attempts as an act of theft, absolutely clear and unmistakable. And thank God there are still enough cautious minds in Europe who are pushing back against this idea. In any case, it would be a major catastrophe for the global financial system if it actually went through. The credibility of all financial institutions in Europe would be thrown into serious doubt. And that's not just about our assets. There are many other sums involved from different parts of the world. Of course, we're not going to just let someone steal our money. We'll use every possible tool to correct the situation, including legal and financial measures. There will definitely be a response. So all those people and politicians who are speaking out against this plan, we believe they're right. It would set a very bad precedent for the entire world.
Ein schlechter Präzedenzfall für die ganze Welt.
Das heißt, die russische
So that means the Russian Federation would take the case to international arbitration courts and wait for a ruling.
und auf ein entsprechendes Urteil warten.
Wir finden ganz
We'll definitely find legal ways, but also economic and financial means. We have plenty of those.
haben wir genug.
Das bedeutet,
Does that mean seizing Western assets, meaning property or wealth in Russia?
Vermögen in
Ich
Russland.
würde
So I'd put that more sharply, make it more concrete.
sparen.
Der New Start-Vertrag ist im Februar ausgelaufen.
The New START treaty expired in February. Now, starting this year, new American missiles are supposed to be stationed exclusively in Germany. I've seen for myself in Russia that the Russian Federation is also continuing to arm itself and expand its missile arsenals. Are we facing a new arms race? Will Germany become the focus of a new, intensified conflict?
Fokus eines neuen, verschärften Konflikts stehen.
Ja, wir haben vorgeschlagen, abgesehen davon, dass
We proposed,
Kollegen aus
apart from the fact that our American colleagues had already withdrawn from several of the most important agreements, like the NF Treaty, the Open Skies Treaty, and the Iran deal, which they had left unilaterally earlier, and the START Treaty, which was crucial. We proposed introducing a moratorium and continuing to adhere to the key provisions of that agreement, even without the agreement itself. And we've maintained that moratorium to this day. Our American colleagues never responded to our proposal. That's unfortunate. These are the most important agreements for global stability. That was not what we wanted. We didn't withdraw from those agreements back then, but our American colleagues chose a different path.
Unsere amerikanischen Kollegen wollten einen anderen Weg.
Inzwischen sind wir beim 20. Sanktionspaket.
We've now reached the 20th sanctions package from the European Union. Russia, meanwhile, is expanding its energy partnerships, especially with China and with other Asian and Southeast Asian countries. The Power of Siberia project alone is worth billions. Russia is also building new nuclear-powered icebreakers to make the Northern Sea route navigable all year round. That's their stated goal. And honestly, that wasn't our initiative. We used to have excellent cooperation with Europe in the energy sector.
Mit der Gründung von St. Petersburg 1703 begonnen hat, jetzt wieder für 300 Jahre zurückgedreht.
Das war eigentlich nicht unsere Initiative. Wir hatten mit Europa tolle Zusammenarbeit im Energiebereich. Mit Deutschland zum Beispiel seit mehr als 50
Take
Jahren.
Germany, for example. More than 50 years of truly excellent cooperation. The gas pipeline goes all the way back to Willy Brandt, and it worked very well. It was an absolute win-win situation. We were, and we remain, reliable and conscientious partners. Our gas and oil deliveries were completely stable and offered at a good price. For the German economy, and I'll use Germany here because it's the clearest example, Germany received the largest share of our energy supplies, both oil and natural gas. With the first Nord Stream 1, the first two lines, that meant 55 billion cubic meters per year. And with that, we were able to meet about 60% of the needs of German industry and households.
Grob gesagt zu 60% befriedigen. Mit Nord Stream 2 dazu, mit den weiteren zwei
With Nord Stream 2, with those additional two lines, we could have counted on another 55 billion cubic meters. Everything was ready. I visited Lubmin myself. Everything there was perfectly prepared. The technical gas was already in, just one word, and it would have been ready to go. Please. Even after the terrorist attack in September 22, President Putin immediately suggested, well, one pipe is still fine. We could use that one. You don't just throw away 27 billion cubic meters. But it was a political decision by our German colleagues. They absolutely didn't want that. So fine. If they don't want it, we have to find other partners. And we did find those partners in other parts of the world.
Wir haben diese Partner gefunden in anderen Teilen der Welt. Nachfrage ist groß.
Demand is high, and together with other colleagues, we've agreed on the necessary arrangements, and things are moving forward. We haven't burned that bridge. From our point of view, we haven't canceled any agreements with Germany in the economic sphere, let alone in other areas. That's simply a matter of what's been agreed upon. And as the president recently said again, if our former European partners come to us with conditions that are stable, reliable, and acceptable for us, then we can start thinking about making a fresh start. But so far, unfortunately, we haven't heard any such proposals from Western capitals. Not from Berlin either.
Who do you think actually blew up the Nord Stream pipeline?
Very good. Very good question. I'd like to know that too. We've been wanting to know that since September 22. That was a terrorist attack. Everyone accepts that now, the previous government and the current one as well. It was clearly a terrorist attack, a crime against Europe's international critical energy infrastructure, because it didn't just involve the Germans and the Russians. Several companies from Western European countries were part of it too. Enormous damage, including to the environment, not to mention everything else. And no one knows who organized it all. There's a Ukrainian colleague somewhere. Yes, another one was released by Poland. And still, no one knows who organized it or who's behind it. It's important to find that out. Otherwise, our Western partners are setting a dangerous precedent. Because letting a terrorist attack on Europe's infrastructure go unpunished like that, that's bad, also for the future.
The American journalist Seymour Hersh came to very clear conclusions here, and for good reasons. He's accusing his own government. What's your take on that?
Well, the investigations we see today, the research that journalists usually do, like, for example, what I've read in the German press, they talk about some kind of yacht called Andromeda, with 5 or 6 private Ukrainian divers, or diving people, who supposedly did all of this. Mr. Bob, German literary culture has given the world some truly outstanding writers. Writers of fairy tales. Every school kid here knows that. The Brothers Grimm, Hoffman. But their fairy tales were convincing and had a lesson to them. These attempts to push the issue off onto private individuals are at the very least reckless. What we need is the truth. Who did this and who's behind it? We want to hear that from the federal government, because the federal government or the federal prosecutor's office is the only authority still pursuing these investigations. The other Scandinavian colleagues have walked away. And yes, we want to get those answers.
How far along are the talks with the American side about restarting the pipeline, possibly through a joint American-Russian consortium?
I can't really say, because I don't know anything about those talks. It might be an interesting option if everyone agreed to it. But what I'm hearing today from the European Commission and also from the German government circles is this: we've ended our energy dependence on Russia. Nord Stream will never be put back into operation. So, that's over, period. Without political will, unfortunately, we can't do anything. First, there has to be political will. And once that's there, then it's up to the business community. And from that point on, things will get a lot easier.
There are already American business people close to President Trump who've raised their hands and expressed their interest.
Those are interesting ideas. We can talk about them. But what really matters is that the buyers also have the political will to act.
When there's real political will, everything becomes a lot easier. If Chancellor Friedrich Merz were to pick up the phone and call Moscow, maybe to prepare a joint meeting with President Putin, what questions, in your view, would need to be put on the table?
That's interesting, what the Chancellor might suggest, of course. But so far, I haven't heard a single word about any such proposals. So, Discussing everything in the subjunctive, in my view, would be counterproductive. I don't want your viewers to get the wrong impression, as if I were inviting anyone to a conversation. I'm not going to do that. Up to now, we haven't seen, I'd say, any signs of such intentions or any real willingness for dialogue. On the contrary, we keep hearing that it's still too early to talk to us. Well, that's up to those who make that decision.
Die diese Entscheidung gefasst haben.
Anders als der deutsche Außenminister.
Unlike what the German foreign minister claimed, that Russia will always be our enemy, there have also been completely different sides to German-Russian relations. There were times of constructive cooperation, including cultural, economic, and even political collaboration. What would it take to rebuild a better relationship?
Ein besseres Verhältnis wiederherzustellen.
Das historische Gepäck.
The historic legacy of good cooperation between Russia and Germany is enormous. You can't just erase that legacy from memory or make it disappear. After the reunification, we built a huge network together with Germany, an incredible joint effort. Maybe there was nothing quite like it with any other Western European country. And it's not just about energy or the energy sector. In politics and in civil society dialogue, it was truly unique. When it comes to culture, we share 1,000 years of collaboration where both nations have enriched each other tremendously. An absolute win-win situation, economically and scientifically.
Wirtschaftlich, wissenschaftlich, Städtepartnerschaften, mehr als 100 Städtepartner.
City partnerships, more than 100 of them, and about 400 partnerships between colleges and universities. Let me repeat that. A unique achievement, a real network. We still have German companies active in the Russian market. Maybe fewer than before, sure, but they still want to stay there. And that's an important factor for any possible future rapprochement. That's where the business community's interest lies. Culture. Absolutely. We haven't abolished German culture. In Russian theaters and concert halls, German composers are still being performed. The Nutcracker is staged at the Bolshoi Theater, and the longest line there is for the Nutcracker.
Nussknacker zu sehen. Es ist das Meisterstück von 3 großen Nationen.
It's a masterpiece created by 3 great nations, Hoffmann, Tchaikovsky, and Petipa, the French ballet master. It's been in high demand. The Bremen Town Musicians, since we already mentioned the Brothers Grimm today, was recently made into a new film in Russia, and it was a huge success. German culture remains an important part of our shared cultural life, and that's part of it too. Unfortunately, we don't have any artists from Russia working in Germany right now. They can't get visas, they can't get entry permits, and they can't go on tour here. Unfortunately, it's just not possible. Not possible. But there are still many things that continue to bring us closer together, and one of them is our culture of remembrance, the way we remember the past after the Second World War.
Die Erinnerungskultur nach dem Zweiten Weltkrieg, Sie wissen, wir haben in Deutschland.
You know, in Germany, we have more than 4,000 Soviet war graves, where over 700,000 Soviet people are buried, people of many different nationalities. We don't divide the victory in that war against Nazism into national compartments. There are Ukrainians, Belarusians, Kazakhs, Jews, all of them lying side by side. These war graves are cared for and maintained in an exemplary way by the War Graves Commission, the German War Graves Association, together with local and regional organizations. For that, we're truly grateful. We saw this again on the 80th anniversary of the victory, and will continue to visit these sites. It's an important tradition that must live on. And these connections between Russia and Germany, that's another example of it.
Die Deutsch-Ukrainische Historische Kommission.
The German-Ukrainian Historical Commission is doing everything it can to reinterpret the coup on the Maidan as a revolution of dignity. Many German historians now describe the Holodomor, the famine catastrophe in southern Russia, as a weapon of starvation used against Ukraine. On the day commemorating the victory over Hitler's dictatorship, ordinary visitors, except for embassy representatives, are no longer allowed to wear the St. George's ribbon. Are we dealing here with a kind of culture war?
Sind wir hier auf der Ebene eines Kulturkampfs?
Ja, schade darum natürlich. Also erstmal was Holodomor anbetrifft.
That's really unfortunate, of course. So, first of all, about the Holodomor. There's a major historical mistake here. And honestly, I'm surprised that the historians you mentioned, the German ones, the Ukrainian ones, interpret it as something anti-Ukrainian. That's simply wrong. There was famine in the former Soviet Union. But the famine wasn't only in Ukraine. It also hit regions of the Russian Federation, the Volga region, and other areas, including Central and Middle Asia. It wasn't, let's say, a distinctly Ukrainian phenomenon. So the idea that it was directed against Ukraine is, I'd say, fundamentally wrong. It was indeed a famine, but not one aimed at Ukraine. All peoples were affected.
Sondern alle Völker wurden involviert. Dann haben Sie gefragt, St. Georg's.
Then they asked about the St. George's ribbon. Well, first of all, it's true that during the solemn commemorations marking the end of the war, we're faced with a ban on the St. George's ribbon. Russian citizens aren't allowed to wear military uniforms, and they're not allowed to sing songs from World War II. That's very sad, because these are our historical symbols. What's more, the St. George's ribbon actually has nothing to do with Ukraine or with Germany. As your viewers may know, it was established by Catherine II back in the 18th century. It has absolutely nothing to do with the present day, but we value these historical symbols and like to use them. Unfortunately, the Commission of Historians, the Russian-German Commission of Historians, no longer functions. But that wasn't our decision.
Der Krieg in der Ukraine, der Krieg.
The war in Ukraine and the war against Iran, the French historian Emmanuel Todd interprets them as two conflicts in the struggle over the decline of the West. He's written a book about it. Are we witnessing a clash between forces that want to preserve a unipolar world led by the United States and those that aim for a multipolar world centered around Beijing and Moscow? How do you interpret this historical struggle?
Dieses geschichtliche Ringen.
Wir sind absolut klar, wir leben schon in.
We're absolutely clear about this. We're already living in the era of a multipolar world. The unipolar world practically doesn't exist anymore. There are many centers of power around the globe that have established themselves as sources of influence and as economic hubs. And that's simply the reality. It's not just Russia. Of course, it's also China, Southeast Asia, India, and Latin America, with its strong industrial growth trends. Naturally, Europe as well. And today, many African countries are showing positive developments that connect us in many ways. That's the reality. Trying to ignore or deny it would be at the very least careless. History will put everything in its proper place, and we're absolutely convinced that the future belongs to the multipolar world. I don't think there's anything worse, even for those who still argue for a unipolar world. But that's the reality. We just have to accept it and live with it.
Some time ago, President Putin addressed the German people. What message would you like to share with the people in Germany?
I'd like to warmly welcome everyone who wants to hear these greetings. We're ready to talk with anyone who truly wants that. We have no issues with the German people in any area. We support the idea of rebuilding this cooperation in the future. For that, you need certain strengths, and you need trust, mutual trust. But I believe hope is the last thing to die. There's a lot more that connects us than divides us. And that's why we can look to the future with at least a bit of optimism.
The ambassador of the Russian Federation to the Federal Republic of Germany, Sergey Nechayev, says, Russia has no problem with the German people. The door to dialogue is open, and that's how we should look toward the future. Thank you very much for that. Here at Against the Current, we present positions and perspectives that the propaganda media choose to hide.
welche die Propagandamedien verschweigen.